London, 1810. The late summer rain hammered against the windows of Thornbury House with relentless persistence, as though the heavens themselves wished to wash away the sins of London's elite. Inside the grand ballroom, however, the glittering assembly remained blissfully dry, swirling across polished floors in a kaleidoscope of silks and jewels, their laughter rising above the orchestra's spirited playing. Lady Evelyn Ashcroft stood at the periphery of it all, a willow among roses, her height rendering her conspicuous even as she attempted to fade into the damask wallpaper. At 27 years of age, she had long since accepted her position in society's cruel hierarchy. Too tall by half, too reserved in manner, too plain in feature, and far, far too old to be considered marriageable by the exacting standards of the ton. "Odd a look at Lady Evelyn," came a voice that carried with malicious clarity above the music. Lady Pemberton, resplendent in peacock blue, held court among a cluster of young matrons, her fan fluttering with affected delicacy, standing there like a lamppost. One would think she might have the decency to sit with the dowagers, rather than hovering about as though she expects an invitation to dance. Tittering laughter followed, sharp as broken glass. Evelyn's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her own fan, but she maintained her composure, her face a mask of serene indifference. She had learned long ago that reaction only fed the beast of society's cruelty. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. Perhaps she believes her advanced years lend her a certain mystique, added Miss Caroline Winters, a beauty of 19, with golden curls and a tongue dipped in venom. Though I cannot imagine what gentleman would find such stature appealing. Why, she towers over most of the men present. Indeed, Lady Pemberton agreed with false sympathy. A tragedy, truly. Her father was a baron of respectable lineage, and her dowry, while modest, is not insignificant. Yet here she remains, year after year, growing older and more desperate with each passing season. Evelyn drew a careful breath, willing herself to remain perfectly still. This was not new. She had endured such commentary for the better part of a decade, ever since her first disastrous season when she had been 17 and still harbored foolish hopes. Her height, which had seemed merely notable in her youth, had become pronounced as she matured, leaving her taller than most gentlemen and nearly all ladies of quality. Combined with features that were handsome rather than pretty, and a natural reserve that others mistook for coldness or pride, she had quickly been labelled unmarriageable. Her younger sister, Beatrice, had made a brilliant match at 18, marrying a viscount with extensive holdings in Derbyshire. Her brother, Edmund, had distinguished himself in Parliament, but Evelyn remained the family's quiet disappointment, the eldest daughter who had failed in her most fundamental duty, securing an advantageous marriage. "I heard Lord Whitmore considered offering for her 3 years ago," Miss Winters continued, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that nonetheless carried across the ballroom. "Sir, but when they stood together at the Devonshire ball, she was a full inch taller than he. The poor man fled to his country estate and married a girl from the local gentry within the month." More laughter. Evelyn fixed her gaze on a point above the assembly, on a cherub painted into the ceiling's elaborate fresco, and imagined herself anywhere but here, in the library at Ashcroft Manor, perhaps, where she could lose herself in the pages of a novel or the complexity of a scientific treatise. Her father, before his death 2 years prior, had encouraged her unconventional interests, filling the manor's library with volumes on natural philosophy, astronomy, and literature. Her mother had despaired of such pursuits, certain they would only make Evelyn more peculiar, but her father had understood. Books, he had told her gently, would be faithful companions when society proved itself wanting. How prophetic those words had been. "Good evening, Lady Evelyn." The voice, deep and edged with frost, cut through her reverie. Evelyn turned to find the Duke of Ashbourne standing before her, his dark eyes unreadable in the candlelight. The ballroom seemed to hush around them, conversations faltering as heads turned to observe this unexpected interaction. Alexander Fitzwilliam, Duke of Ashbourne, was considered the most eligible bachelor in England, despite his reputation for coldness that bordered on cruelty. At 32, he possessed the kind of severe handsomeness that made young ladies swoon and their mothers scheme. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, hair as black as ink, and eyes the color of winter storms. His fortune was immense, his lineage impeccable, and his manner so forbidding that none dared approach him without trembling. He was also, if the rumors were to be believed, utterly without heart. In the 5 years since inheriting his title upon his father's sudden death, the Duke had rejected every matrimonial overture with crushing efficiency. Lady Clarissa Beaumont, widely acknowledged as the diamond of her season, had reportedly wept for a week after his cold dismissal. Miss Arabella Sutton had been so humiliated by his public indifference that her family had removed to their estates in Yorkshire and not returned to London since, and now he stood before Evelyn, his expression inscrutable, drawing every eye in the ballroom. "Your Grace," Evelyn managed, executing a curtsy despite her height. Even with her eyes lowered, she remained nearly level with his gaze. "Good evening." "I understand you have been standing here unattended for quite some time," the Duke observed, his tone carrying that particular quality that made one uncertain whether he was being solicitous or mocking. "Tell me, Lady Evelyn, is there some fascinating architectural feature of Lord Thornbury's ballroom that has captured your attention so completely? Or are you perhaps conducting a scientific study on the behavioral patterns of the aristocracy?" Heat flooded Evelyn's cheeks. The comment, delivered in that cool, measured voice, could be interpreted as either genuine curiosity or veiled insult. Around them, she could feel the weight of observation, the held breath of society waiting to see how she would respond. "Do I confess, Your Grace," she replied, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster, "that I find both the architecture and the behavioral patterns worthy of study, though I suspect the former possesses greater consistency and less capacity for malice." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, too quickly to identify. A scholar's answer, how refreshing. He paused, and in that silence, Evelyn felt the trap closing. "Though I wonder, Lady Evelyn, if your scholarly pursuits have left you equipped for more practical endeavors. Can you dance, for instance, or has that particular accomplishment been neglected in favor of your books?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Around them, Evelyn could hear the barely suppressed titters, could feel the collective lean forward of the assembly, eager to witness her humiliation. "I can dance, Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the mortification burning through her, "though I confess I am rarely given opportunity to demonstrate the skill." "How unfortunate," the Duke replied, and there was something in his tone, something cold and deliberate, that made Evelyn's stomach clench with dread, though perhaps not surprising. After all, one must consider the practical difficulties. His gaze swept over her with clinical assessment. "Your height, for instance, presents certain challenges. Most gentlemen prefer to lead in the dance, yet you would tower over the majority of potential partners. Rather emasculating, I should think." The ballroom erupted in barely concealed laughter. Even those who had previously pretended not to listen now turned openly, their faces alight with the cruel pleasure of witnessing another's degradation. Lady Pemberton's fan fluttered triumphantly. Miss Winters whispered behind her gloved hand to her companions, and Evelyn stood frozen, the Duke's words striking with the precision of carefully aimed arrows. This was different from the casual cruelty of gossips. This was calculated, public, and delivered by the most powerful man in the room. There would be no recovering from this. Whatever small dignity she had maintained, whatever thin veneer of respectability had shielded her, was now shattered beyond repair. "I see," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Your Grace, for your candid assessment." She curtsied again, deeper this time, and when she rose, she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "If you will excuse me." Evelyn walked from the ballroom with measured steps, her spine straight, her head high, even as she felt the weight of every mocking gaze following her exit. She did not hurry, she did not falter. Only when she reached the safety of the retiring room, blessedly empty at this hour, did she allow herself to lean against the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The Duke of Ashbourne had just publicly and deliberately destroyed what remained of her reputation. By morning, all of London would know. The too tall spinster who fancied herself a scholar had been put firmly in her place by the coldest man in England. Evelyn closed her eyes, fighting back tears she refused to shed. She had endured mockery before, had weathered years of subtle and overt cruelty, but this felt different. This felt final. The Duke's words had not merely wounded her pride, they had eliminated any possibility that she might still, against all odds, find a place in society. Very well, then. If society had no place for her, she would find somewhere that did. By the time Evelyn returned to the ballroom to locate her mother and request their departure, her decision had crystallized. She would leave London, not temporarily, as one might retreat to a country estate for the summer, but permanently. She would find somewhere she could be useful, somewhere her height and intelligence would be assets rather than liabilities. Her mother, Lady Margaret Ashcroft, was deep in conversation with the Dowager Countess of Roxbury when Evelyn approached. "Mamma," she said softly, "I am unwell." "Might we depart?" Lady Margaret's eyes swept over her daughter with practiced assessment, noting the pallor beneath Evelyn's composed expression. Whatever she saw there made her lips thin with understanding. "Of course, my dear, I shall call for the carriage." They rode home in silence, the rain having subsided to a gentle patter against the carriage windows. Only when they were safely within their townhouse on Curzon Street did Lady Margaret speak. "But what happened?" Evelyn removed her gloves with deliberate care. "The Duke of Ashbourne found my presence at the ball worthy of commentary." "Oh, Evelyn." Her mother's voice carried a weight of resignation that hurt more than sympathy might have. "What did he say?" "Nothing that has not been thought by others," Evelyn replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "He merely had the honesty to speak it aloud." Lady Margaret sank onto a settee, suddenly looking every one of her 48 years. "This will be difficult to overcome." "I do not intend to overcome it, Mamma." Evelyn turned to face her mother directly. "I intend to leave London." "Leave? Evelyn, you cannot simply—" "I can, and I shall." Evelyn's voice remained calm, but beneath it ran a current of steel. "I have been a burden to this family long enough. Beatrice is well settled. Edmund needs no sister hovering about, reminding society of the family's failure to marry off its eldest daughter, and you, Mamma, should not have to endure the pity and gossip that follow me wherever I go." "Where would you go?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice small. "I have been corresponding with Cousin Philippa in Gloucestershire," Evelyn said, referring to her father's widowed cousin who managed a small school for young ladies. "She has mentioned several times that she could use assistance with instruction. The girls study literature, natural philosophy, mathematics. I could be useful there." "A governess?" Her mother's horror was evident. "Evelyn, your father was a baron. You are a gentleman's daughter. To become a teacher, Iseult, would be preferable to remaining here as an object of ridicule," Evelyn finished firmly. "Mamma, I am 27. I have no prospects, no hope of marriage, and apparently, as of tonight, no remaining dignity. Let me go somewhere I might have purpose." Lady Margaret studied her daughter's face, and something in her expression softened. "You are not a failure, Evelyn. Society is narrow and cruel, but that does not diminish your worth." "Perhaps not," Evelyn conceded, "but it does diminish my happiness here. Please, Mamma, give me your blessing." The silence stretched between them, filled with all the unspoken disappointments and thwarted hopes of the past decade. Finally, Lady Margaret nodded. "Very well. I shall write to Philippa tomorrow. But Evelyn," she caught her daughter's hand, "promise me this is not simply running away." "It is not running away," Evelyn said quietly. "It is choosing a different path." Within a fortnight, arrangements had been made. Cousin Philippa, who had indeed been desperate for assistance with her growing school, welcomed Evelyn's offer with enthusiastic relief. The Ashcroft family's townhouse was closed for the season, Lady Margaret returning to Ashcroft Manor, while Evelyn departed for Gloucestershire. The gossip, as expected, was merciless. Lady Evelyn Ashcroft, humiliated beyond recovery by the Duke of Ashbourne, had fled London in disgrace. Some claimed she had gone mad with embarrassment. Others suggested she had taken religious orders, a few saw with the cruelty particular to those who had themselves felt the sting of social rejection, expressed satisfaction that she had finally accepted her place. The Duke of Ashbourne, when informed of Lady Evelyn's departure, merely raised an eyebrow and returned to his correspondence. If he felt any remorse for his role in driving her from London, he gave no indication of it, and so the matter was considered closed. Lady Evelyn Ashcroft had left London, and London, with the short memory of the perpetually distracted, soon found new subjects for its gossip and cruelty. 2 years passed. The Duke of Ashbourne stood in his study at Ashbourne House, reviewing the latest reports from his steward with the same meticulous attention he applied to all matters of business. Outside, London was preparing for the season's opening ball at the Pemberton estate, but Alexander found himself unusually reluctant to attend. These events had become intolerable. The same vapid conversations, the same ambitious mothers parading their daughters before him like prized cattle, the same tedious dance of social niceties that meant nothing and accomplished less. He had built a reputation for coldness deliberately, as armor against the grasping hands of fortune hunters and social climbers. Better to be feared and left alone than to be pursued by women who saw only his title and wealth. Yet lately, the isolation his manor had secured felt less like protection and more like imprisonment. Your Grace, his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, appeared at the door. The carriage is ready. You are expected at the ball within the hour. Alexander glanced at the clock. 8 o'clock. Another evening of tedium stretched before him. Very well. The Pemberton ball was, as expected, a crush. The cream of London society filled the ballroom, their jewels glittering in the light of 1,000 candles. Alexander made his entrance with the casualness of one who knew his mere presence was an event worthy of note. Conversations paused as he passed. Young ladies blushed and whispered behind fans. Ambitious mothers positioned their daughters in his path. He acknowledged greetings with cool courtesy, accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman, and surveyed the assembly with the practiced eye of one evaluating a business prospect. Nothing had changed. The same faces, the same games, the same... His thoughts stuttered to a halt. Standing near the terrace doors, in conversation with the Dowager Countess of Roxbury, was a woman he did not recognize. Tall, elegant, and striking, rather than conventionally pretty, she wore a gown of deep emerald silk that should have been too bold for an unmarried woman, but somehow suited her perfectly. Her dark hair was arranged in an intricate style that emphasized the elegant column of her neck. Her posture was impeccable, her bearing aristocratic without being haughty, and she was, quite notably, taller than most of the men in the immediate vicinity. Something stirred in Alexander's memory, some half-forgotten impression, but before he could grasp it, Lady Pemberton materialized at his elbow. Your Grace, how delightful that you could attend. Her smile was calculating beneath its warmth. You must allow me to introduce you to Miss Caroline Winters. She has just returned from a tour of the continent and is most accomplished. Alexander barely heard her, his attention still fixed on the unknown woman by the terrace. Who is that? He asked abruptly, nodding in her direction. Lady Pemberton followed his gaze, and something complicated crossed her face. Surprise, perhaps, or unease. That, Your Grace, is Lady Evelyn Ashcroft. Though I confess, I am astonished to see her here. We understood she had removed permanently to the country. The name struck Alexander like a physical blow. Lady Evelyn Ashcroft, the too tall spinster he had publicly humiliated 2 years ago at Lord Thornbury's ball. The woman who had fled London rather than endure the aftermath of his cruelty. But this woman, this elegant creature conversing with ease and poise, bore little resemblance to the shrinking wallflower he remembered. Or rather, she bore resemblance in feature and height, but everything else about her had transformed. Where once she had attempted to make herself small, to fade into backgrounds, she now stood with confidence. Where once she had dressed in pale, self-effacing colors, she now wore a bold jewel tone that commanded attention. As though sensing his scrutiny, Lady Evelyn glanced in his direction. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Alexander felt the impact of her gaze like a sword thrust. There was recognition in those eyes, and something else. Not the humiliation or fear he might have expected, but a cool assessment that left him feeling strangely exposed. She inclined her head in the barest acknowledgement, a gesture so minimal it might have been missed by others, then deliberately turned her attention back to the dowager. It was a dismissal, subtle, perfectly proper, and absolutely clear. The Duke of Ashbourne had been acknowledged and found unworthy of further notice. The novelty of it struck Alexander with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had dismissed him? When had anyone dared to look at him with anything other than fear, desire, or calculation? "Your Grace?" Lady Pemberton's voice penetrated his thoughts. "Shall I make the introduction to Miss Winters?" "Later, perhaps," Alexander murmured, his attention still fixed on Lady Evelyn. She was laughing now at something the dowager had said, her face transformed by genuine amusement. How had he ever thought her plain? The strong features that had seemed harsh in her youth had matured into striking handsomeness. Her height, which he had mocked so cruelly, now seemed regal rather than awkward. And her eyes, when they had met his, had held an intelligence and depth that made every vapid beauty in the room pale by comparison. What had happened to her in these 2 years? And why did seeing her transformed make his chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to regret? Throughout the evening, Alexander found himself tracking Lady Evelyn's movements through the ballroom with an attention that bordered on obsession. She danced 3 times, partnered by gentlemen who seemed unbothered by her height. Indeed, her first partner, Lord Ashworth, was himself quite tall and seemed delighted by the match. Her conversation, when Alexander was close enough to observe, appeared animated and intelligent. The dowagers and matrons who had once whispered behind fans about her peculiarities now sought her company. It was as though she had become an entirely different person, or perhaps, Alexander thought with uncomfortable insight, as though she had finally become herself. Remarkable, is it not? The Dowager Countess of Roxbury appeared at his elbow, following his gaze with knowing eyes. Lady Evelyn's transformation. Alexander schooled his features to indifference. "I had heard she left London." "She did. Removed to Gloucestershire to assist her cousin with a school for young ladies." The dowager's tone suggested she found this fact both surprising and admirable. "By all accounts, she has been remarkably successful. The school has gained quite a reputation for academic excellence. Lady Evelyn apparently teaches natural philosophy and literature." "A school teacher," Alexander murmured, the words carrying more respect than condescension. "Indeed. Though she has returned to London for the season at her sister's insistence, the Viscountess Fairmont felt it was time for Lady Evelyn to rejoin society. And I must say, I agree." The dowager paused meaningfully. 2 years ago, Lady Evelyn was cowed by society's cruelty. She has returned confident in her own worth. The change is quite striking. The rebuke, delivered in the dowager's gentle tone, struck home nonetheless. Alexander remembered his own words at the Thornbury ball, the deliberate humiliation he had inflicted. At the time, he had told himself he was simply stating unpleasant truths, that someone needed to make Lady Evelyn understand her position. Now, watching her move through the ballroom with grace and assurance, he recognized his cruelty for what it had been, the lashing out of a man too frozen in his own isolation to recognize genuine worth when he encountered it. "She seems well," he said carefully. "She is well," the dowager corrected, "and she has no need of society's approval anymore, which makes her rather dangerous, does it not? A woman who does not require validation is a woman who cannot be controlled." With that pointed observation, the dowager moved away, leaving Alexander to contemplate the uncomfortable truth of her words. The evening wore on. Alexander danced mechanically with the appropriate partners, conducted the expected conversations, fulfilled his social obligations with the same cold efficiency that had become his hallmark. But through it all, His attention remained fractured, constantly drawn back to Lady Evelyn. It was near midnight when fate, or perhaps the dowager's meddling, brought them face to face. Alexander had stepped onto the terrace for air, the stuffiness of the ballroom becoming oppressive. The night was clear, stars visible despite London's lights, and he stood at the stone balustrade, breathing deeply of the cool air. "Your Grace." The voice, low and cultured, came from the shadows to his left. Alexander turned to find Lady Evelyn standing in the doorway, the light from the ballroom silhouetting her form. "Lady Evelyn," he acknowledged, straightening. "I did not realize the terrace was occupied." "I was just leaving," she replied, moving to pass him. But some impulse he did not fully understand, made Alexander step into her path. "Wait." She paused, regarding him with that same cool assessment that had struck him earlier. Up close, he could see the changes even more clearly. There was a self-possession in her bearing that had been entirely absent 2 years ago. Whatever shadows had haunted her eyes then had been replaced by a clarity that was almost unsettling. "Yes, Your Grace." "I wish to welcome you back to London," Alexander said, the words stilted even to his own ears. "I understand you have been in Gloucestershire." "How kind of you to take an interest," Lady Evelyn replied, her tone perfectly polite and utterly devoid of warmth. "Yes, I have been teaching at my cousin's school. The work has been most fulfilling. You seem well." "I am well, thank you." She moved to step around him again. "Now, if you will excuse me, Lady Evelyn." Alexander's hand shot out, not touching her but blocking her path. "I wonder if we might speak plainly for a moment." Her eyebrows rose, and there was something in her expression, a hint of steel beneath the polish, that made Alexander's pulse quicken inexplicably. "I was unaware we had ever spoken any other way, Your Grace. As I recall, you were remarkably plain in your speech at our last encounter." The reference to the Thornbury ball hung between them, unavoidable. Alexander felt heat creep up his neck, an unfamiliar sensation. When was the last time he had felt shame? "About that evening," he began, then faltered. What could he say? That he was sorry. The apology seemed inadequate for the damage he had inflicted. That he had been wrong. She clearly no longer cared for his opinion on the matter. Lady Evelyn saved him from his floundering. "Your Grace, whatever you wish to say about that evening is unnecessary. You expressed your views on my person and prospects with admirable clarity. I took your words to heart, made appropriate adjustments to my situation, and find myself much happier for it. Indeed, I should perhaps thank you. Your cruelty provided the impetus I needed to leave a life that was making me miserable." The words, delivered without heat or emotion, struck harder than anger would have. She meant them. His deliberate humiliation had driven her from London, but rather than destroying her, it had freed her. "I see," Alexander managed. "Then you bear me no ill will." Lady Evelyn's smile was cool and enigmatic. "I bear you no thought at all, Your Grace. You are as irrelevant to my current happiness as you were instrumental in ending my former misery. Now, truly, I must return to the ballroom. Good evening." This time, he let her pass. Alexander remained on the terrace long after she had gone, staring out at the darkened garden without seeing it. Lady Evelyn's words echoed in his mind, each one a carefully placed dart. She bore him no thought at all. He was irrelevant to her. The dismissal was complete, and more cutting than any anger or resentment could have been. Why did that bother him so much? He was the Duke of Ashbourne, one of the most powerful men in England. He had trained himself to be indifferent to others' opinions, to feel nothing beyond the cold satisfaction of maintaining control. Yet here he stood, unsettled by a woman who had made it clear she considered him beneath her notice. More than unsettled, he realized with uncomfortable awareness. He was intrigued, captivated even, by this transformed woman who looked at him with clear-eyed indifference and spoke to him with polite dismissal. Every other woman in London sought his attention, his approval, his favor. Lady Evelyn alone treated him as though he were simply another gentleman of moderate interest and less import. It was refreshing, disturbing, wholly unexpected, and absolutely compelling. The following day saw Alexander doing something he had never done before, actively seeking out a woman's company, with no clear understanding of his own motivations. He attended events he would normally have avoided, appeared at gatherings he would typically have dismissed as beneath his notice, all in hopes of encountering Lady Evelyn. When he did see her, their interactions were brief and scrupulously polite. She acknowledged him with cool courtesy, never lingering, never seeking him out, always moving away at the first polite opportunity. It was maddening. It was fascinating. It was unlike anything Alexander had experienced in his carefully controlled life. "You are staring at Lady Evelyn again," his friend Lord Ashworth observed one evening at the theatre. "Rather obviously, I might add." Alexander forced his attention back to the stage, where some melodrama was unfolding that he had no interest in. "I was merely observing the audience." Ashworth's tone suggested disbelief. "You do realize you are the subject of considerable speculation, the Duke of Ashbourne attending every social event, watching Lady Evelyn Ashcroft with rather obvious interest. People are beginning to wonder." "Let them wonder," Alexander replied, surprised by his own indifference to the gossip. Once, he would have been furious at being the subject of speculation. Now, he found he did not care. "She will not forgive you easily," Ashworth said more seriously, "if forgiveness is what you seek. I was present at the Thornbury ball 2 years ago. I heard what you said to her. It was unnecessarily cruel, Alexander." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I am aware. Are you?" Ashworth studied him with the frankness of long friendship. "Because you have never been one to question your own actions, to second-guess your judgments. Yet here you are, clearly disturbed by Lady Evelyn's indifference, possibly even regretful of your past behavior. It is quite unlike you." "Perhaps I am changing," Alexander said quietly. "Or perhaps," Ashworth suggested, "you have finally met a woman who sees you clearly and is not impressed by what she sees." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Alexander had spent years cultivating an image of cold perfection, of untouchable superiority. He had believed himself content in his isolation, secure in his fortress of ice. Now, Lady Evelyn had looked at that fortress and found it unworthy of even attempting to scale. The realization that he wanted her to try, wanted her to care whether he had changed or remained frozen, was as unsettling as it was undeniable. The confrontation came at the Brentwood musical, an event Alexander would normally have avoided, but attended specifically because he knew Lady Evelyn would be present. The performance had just concluded when he noticed a commotion near the refreshment room. Lady Evelyn stood pale but composed, while Lady Remington, a countess known for her sharp tongue and social cruelty, addressed her in a voice pitched to carry, "My dear Lady Evelyn, how charming to see you return to London. Tell me, is it true you spent the last 2 years as a governess? How very industrious of you." The emphasis on the word made clear its intended insult. Teaching was considered barely respectable for impoverished gentlewomen, certainly nothing a baron's daughter would choose, unless driven by desperate circumstances. "I was a teacher, Lady Remington," Evelyn corrected calmly. "At a school my cousin operates. We provide education in literature, natural philosophy, mathematics, and the arts to young ladies whose families value learning over mere social accomplishment." "How fascinating," Lady Remington's smile was venomous. "And did your students tower over their desks as you do? I wonder how one maintains authority when one is built more like a man than a woman." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. It was one thing to mock behind fans, quite another to deliver such cutting insult directly and publicly. Evelyn's face remained composed, but Alexander saw her fingers tighten around her fan, saw the brief flash of pain in her eyes before she mastered it. Something inside Alexander, something frozen and dead for years, suddenly cracked. He found himself moving before conscious thought engaged, crossing the room in swift strides that had guests hastily stepping from his path. He reached Lady Evelyn's side as she opened her mouth to respond to Lady Remington's insult. "Lady Remington!" His voice cut through the space like a blade of ice. "I am astonished by your comments, truly astonished." The Countess turned, her face paling as she realized the Duke of Ashbourne had witnessed her cruelty. "Your Grace, You merely demonstrated that while Lady Evelyn has spent these past years enlarging her mind and improving herself, You have remained as small in spirit as ever." His tone was conversational, which somehow made the words more cutting. How unfortunate that some people mistake spite for wit. Lady Remington's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around them, the assembly watched with avid attention, sensing scandal unfolding. Alexander turned to Evelyn, who regarded him with surprise and something else, wariness perhaps, or confusion. He made a decision in that moment, one that would likely be as confusing to him later as it was to her now, but felt utterly right. He dropped to one knee before her. The collective gasp was audible. Someone in the back of the room let out a small shriek. Lady Remington looked as though she might faint. "Your Grace," Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing?" Alexander took her hand in both of his, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was simultaneously respectful and intimate. "I am apologizing, Lady Evelyn. Publicly. As befits the public nature of my previous offense." "I don't understand," she said faintly, and he could feel the tremor in her fingers. "2 years ago, I spoke to you with cruel disregard for your feelings or worth," Alexander said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "I mocked your height, disparaged your intelligence, and humiliated you before society. I was wrong, profoundly, inexcusably wrong." He pressed another kiss to her knuckles, feeling her hand shake in his grasp. "You are not too tall. You are magnificent. You are not too old. You are a woman of depth and maturity that shallow girls cannot match. You are not too plain. You are striking in a way that true beauty always is, challenging and impossible to ignore." Evelyn stared at him as though he had begun speaking in tongues. "Your Grace, you need not—" "I need to," he interrupted firmly. "I need to acknowledge my cruelty. I need to make clear that Lady Remington's insults reflect her own inadequacy, not yours. And I need to confess that in the week since your return to London, I have come to realize something." "What?" The word came out strangled. Alexander smiled then, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face after years of cold masks. "That I am an arrogant fool who drove away the most interesting woman in London because I was too frozen to recognize warmth when it was before me." He rose to his feet, still holding her hand, and faced the assembled guests with the full weight of his ducal authority. "Let it be known that anyone who speaks ill of Lady Evelyn Ashcroft speaks ill in my hearing, and I do not tolerate insults to those I hold in the highest regard." Then, before she could respond, before he could question his own sanity, Alexander raised her hand once more to his lips, this time turning it to press a kiss to her palm, a gesture so intimate that several matrons gasped audibly. "Good evening, Lady Evelyn," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I hope you will permit me to call upon you tomorrow." He released her hand and walked from the musicale with the same controlled grace with which he had entered, leaving behind a room erupting in frantic whispers and a woman standing frozen in shock. Evelyn remained motionless for several heartbeats, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The Duke of Ashbourne, the man who had driven her from London with his cruel words, had just knelt before her, had kissed her hand, had publicly declared her magnificent and defended her honor against Lady Remington's venom. It made no sense. It defied all logic and understanding. Well, the Dowager Countess of Roxbury appeared at her elbow, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "That was quite the most romantic thing I have witnessed in 30 years of attending London events. The Duke is thoroughly smitten, my dear." "He is mad," Evelyn managed, finding her voice at last. "There is no other explanation." "Perhaps," the Dowager agreed serenely. "Though I have observed him watching you these past weeks with the expression of a man who has discovered water after crossing a desert. I suspect his madness is of a very particular variety." Evelyn shook her head, attempting to clear it. 2 years ago he humiliated me. Tonight I do not know what he did tonight, but it cannot be sincere. It must be some elaborate jest, some new form of cruelty. My dear child, the Dowager took her arm gently, I have known Alexander Fitzwilliam since he was in leading strings. He is many things, cold, arrogant, difficult, but he is not a man given to jests or elaborate schemes. If he knelt before you tonight, It was because he meant every word he spoke. "But why?" Evelyn's voice cracked slightly. "Why now? Why this sudden transformation?" "Perhaps because you transformed first," the Dowager suggested. 2 years ago, you were trying to make yourself invisible, to apologize for your very existence. You returned to London confident in your worth, indifferent to others' opinions, and living a life of purpose. Such qualities are remarkably attractive to a man who has spent his entire life surrounded by people who want something from him. Evelyn pressed a hand to her temple, where a headache was beginning to form. "I need to leave. I cannot think clearly here." "Of course. I shall have my carriage take you home." The Dowager squeezed her arm. "But Evelyn, do not dismiss this too hastily. The Duke may have been cruel once, but people can change. And from what I observed tonight, he has changed rather dramatically." The ride home to her sister's townhouse on Mount Street was a blur. Evelyn's mind kept replaying the scene. The Duke kneeling, his voice clear and firm as he apologized, the warmth in his eyes as he called her magnificent. It felt like a dream, or perhaps a fever vision. Beatrice was waiting up for her, as Evelyn had known she would be. Her sister, the Viscountess Fairmont, possessed an uncanny ability to sense when drama had occurred. "Tell me everything," Beatrice demanded the moment Evelyn entered the drawing room. "The Hastings footman returned from the musicale 20 minutes ago with the most extraordinary tale about the Duke of Ashbourne kneeling before you in public." Evelyn sank onto a sofa, suddenly exhausted. "It happened much as described, I imagine. Lady Remington insulted me. The Duke intervened. He then proceeded to apologize for his behavior 2 years ago. On his knees," Beatrice added, her eyes bright with excitement. "Before all of society. Evelyn, do you understand what this means? That he has taken leave of his senses." "That he is courting you," Beatrice corrected. "The Duke of Ashbourne, the most eligible bachelor in England, has publicly declared his regard for you. By morning, every household in London will know. You will be the most talked-about woman of the season." Evelyn closed her eyes. "That is precisely what I wish to avoid." "Too late now," Beatrice said, though not without sympathy. "The question is, what will you do about it?" "Nothing," Evelyn replied firmly. "I shall refuse to see him if he calls. I shall make clear that while I accept his apology, I have no interest in whatever game he is playing." "And if it is not a game?" Beatrice challenged. What if the Duke genuinely regrets his past behavior and wishes to make amends? Then he may assuage his conscience through prayer and good works," Evelyn said sharply. "He does not need my forgiveness or participation to feel better about himself." Beatrice studied her sister's face. "You are afraid?" "I am practical," Evelyn corrected. 2 years ago, that man destroyed what little confidence I possessed. I have spent these years rebuilding myself, finding purpose and contentment away from society's cruelty. I will not allow him to disrupt that peace simply because he has decided, for whatever incomprehensible reason, to notice me now. "But what if he has truly changed?" Beatrice pressed. "What if his feelings are genuine?" Evelyn met her sister's eyes. "Then he shall have to prove it, shan't he? Because pretty words and dramatic gestures mean nothing. I learned that lesson the hard way." True to his word, the Duke called the following afternoon. Evelyn, equally true to her word, refused to see him. She watched from her chamber window as he stood on the front step, his expression unreadable as Beatrice's butler delivered Evelyn's regrets. He did not argue, did not insist, simply nodded and departed. But his carriage remained stationed across the street for the remainder of the afternoon, a visible reminder of his presence. The flowers arrived the next day. Not the ostentatious bouquets typically favored by courting gentlemen, but a single stem of white heather, accompanied by a card in bold handwriting. "For courage and protection. I remember you mentioned in conversation with the Dowager that it was your favorite." "A Helfer?" Evelyn stared at the offering, her heart performing uncomfortable acrobatics in her chest. He had remembered that night at the musicale, weeks ago, when she had been speaking with the Dowager Countess. He must have been nearby, listening. She had mentioned heather only in passing, noting how it reminded her of the moors near her cousin's school in Gloucestershire. "He is persistent," Beatrice observed, examining the flower. "Dose, you must admit that. Persistence is not virtue, Evelyn replied, though she carefully placed the heather in water rather than discarding it. The following day brought a book, a first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, accompanied by another card. For the scholar I failed to appreciate a Effie. Then came a donation in her name to the Foundling Hospital, followed by a letter to her cousin's school offering financial support for 3 additional scholarships for girls whose families could not afford tuition. Each gift was thoughtful, personal, and utterly unlike the typical overtures of a gentleman courting favor. They spoke to someone who had paid attention, who had listened and remembered details about who she was and what mattered to her. It was infuriating. It was confusing. It was beginning to crack the armor Evelyn had so carefully constructed around her heart. "You must speak with him eventually," Beatrice said after the 5th refused call, if only to tell him to cease these attentions. "Very well," Evelyn conceded, though her pulse quickened with trepidation. "If he calls tomorrow, I shall receive him." Briefly. The Duke arrived precisely at 2 o'clock the following afternoon, as though he had been waiting for the slightest opening. Evelyn met him in the drawing room, standing rather than sitting, a deliberate choice to keep the interview brief and formal. "Your Grace," she greeted him with a curtsy, "thank you for your gifts. However, I must ask that you discontinue these attentions." Alexander stood near the door, as though afraid that coming further into the room might cause her to flee. He looked different than she remembered, less remote, more human. There were shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he was sleeping poorly. "May I ask why?" His voice was quiet, lacking the cold authority she associated with him. "Because I do not understand your purpose," Evelyn replied honestly. "2 years ago, you made your opinion of me abundantly clear. Now suddenly you profess regard and admiration. Forgive me if I find this transformation suspicious." "You think I am mocking you," Alexander said, and there was something in his tone, hurt, perhaps, or resignation, that made her pause. "I think you are doing something," Evelyn said carefully. "What that something is, I cannot fathom, but I learned a difficult lesson 2 years ago, Your Grace. I learned not to trust easily, especially not men who speak with honeyed tongues one moment and venom the next." Alexander flinched as though struck. "I deserved that." "You did," she agreed. "You deserved that and more. Do you have any idea what your words did to me that night? How they confirmed every cruel thought I had ever had about myself? How they made me feel utterly worthless?" "I know." His voice was rough with emotion. "As God help me, I know, and I would give anything to take those words back. But you cannot," Evelyn said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the tears threatening. "Words, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Wounds once inflicted do not simply disappear because the one who wielded the knife decides to apologize." "I understand that." Alexander took a step closer, his hands clenched at his sides, as though physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "I understand that you have every reason to despise me, to refuse my presence, to reject any attempt I might make to demonstrate how profoundly I regret my cruelty." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "But Lady Evelyn, please allow me to at least try to make amends, not because I expect forgiveness, and certainly not because I believe I deserve it, but because I cannot bear the knowledge that I caused you such pain and did nothing to address it." Evelyn studied his face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. She found only raw sincerity, vulnerability so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Why?" she asked softly. "But why does it matter to you now when it did not matter then?" Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Because I was a fool. Because I had spent so many years building walls around myself, convincing myself that coldness was strength and isolation was safety, that I could not recognize genuine worth when it stood before me." He met her eyes. "Because in driving you away, I drove away the one person in London who might have seen me as something other than a title and fortune." "You do not know me," Evelyn protested. "Not truly. How can you possibly know that?" "But I do know you," Alexander countered. "I know you from watching you these past weeks. I know you from the way you speak to the Dowager with genuine warmth rather than calculated deference. I know you from the light in your eyes when you discuss your students and their achievements. I know you from your strength in facing society after what it did to you, after what I did to you. He took another step closer. And I know you from the memory of that night at the Thornbury ball, when you stood alone against the mockery of people who should have cherished you and maintained your dignity even as I stripped it away. That strength, that grace under cruelty, it haunted me, Evelyn. It haunts me still. Evelyn found herself unable to look away from his face, from the raw emotion there. This was not the cold Duke of Ashbourne she had feared and resented. This was a man stripped of his armor, vulnerable and sincere in a way that terrified her precisely because it felt real. I cannot do this, she whispered. I cannot allow myself to believe in you, to trust you, only to discover it was all some elaborate cruelty or that your interest will wane once the novelty wears off. Then do not believe in me yet, Alexander said urgently. Do not trust me yet, but please give me the opportunity to earn that trust. Allow me to demonstrate through actions, not words, that my regard is sincere. How? The question escaped before Evelyn could stop it. How would you demonstrate such a thing? However you wish, Alexander replied. If you want me to call upon you daily, I shall. If you want me to stay away entirely, I shall do that as well, though it would pain me. If you want me to perform some task or meet some condition, name it and it is done. Evelyn shook her head slowly. You are asking me to give you a chance to court me. I am asking you to give me a chance to know you, Alexander corrected, to prove that my apology was not empty words, that my regard is not passing fancy. Whether that courtship leads anywhere is entirely your decision. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Evelyn's mind warred with her heart. Logic dictated she refuse, that she protect herself from potential heartbreak. But something deeper, something she had tried to suppress since his dramatic appearance at the musicale, whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, people could change. Very well, she said finally, the words feeling momentous. You may call upon me. We may spend time together, but I promise you nothing, Your Grace. No expectations, no guarantees. If at any point I feel you are insincere, or that this is merely some game, I will end it immediately. Alexander's face transformed with such genuine joy that Evelyn felt her breath catch. Thank you, he said fervently. I swear you will not regret this. I already regret it, Evelyn muttered, but there was no heat in her words. May I? Alexander hesitated, then gestured toward the chairs. May I sit with you for a while? I promise to leave whenever you wish, but I would very much like to simply talk with you. Against her better judgment, Evelyn nodded and took a seat. Alexander sat across from her, carefully maintaining a respectful distance, and began to speak. What followed was the most unexpected conversation Evelyn had ever experienced. The Duke of Ashbourne, notorious for his cold formality, spoke to her with disarming openness about his life. He told her of his difficult relationship with his father, a man who had valued duty above all else, and had raised his son to be a perfect aristocrat, but never a happy human being. He spoke of the loneliness of his position, the isolation that came from being constantly pursued for what he represented rather than who he was. I learned early that coldness was protection, Alexander admitted. If I felt nothing, I could not be hurt. If I cared for no one could disappoint me. It was a miserable existence, but it felt safe. What changed? Evelyn found herself asking, drawn into the conversation despite her reservations. You did, he said simply. Or rather, seeing what I had done to you changed something in me. When I learned you had left London, I told myself it did not matter. But then I would remember the look in your eyes that night, the way you held yourself together even as I tore you apart, and I felt something I had not felt in years. What was that? Shame, Alexander replied quietly. Genuine, sickening shame for what I had done to another person. It forced me to examine myself, to acknowledge that in protecting myself, I had become someone I despised, someone cruel and small, despite all my wealth and power. Evelyn listened, searching his face for signs of manipulation or performance. She found only sincerity, painful and raw. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation ranging from profound to mundane, from philosophical to practical. Evelyn discovered that the Duke possessed a sharp wit when not wielding it as a weapon, that he read extensively, that he harbored a secret passion for astronomy and spent clear nights on the roof of Ashbourne House with a telescope. "You must think me quite odd," he said with self-deprecating humour, "a duke who would rather study stars than attend balls." "I think you sound like someone I would have enjoyed knowing," Evelyn replied before she could think better of it. "Years before. And now," Alexander asked quietly, "might you still enjoy knowing me?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "Perhaps," she admitted, "though trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild." "I understand." Alexander rose, recognizing the signal that their time was ending. "Thank you for receiving me today. It means more than I can express." At the door, he turned back. "Evelyn, I want you to know something. Regardless of what happens between us, regardless of whether you ever come to trust me or care for me, you are not too tall, too old, or too plain. You are extraordinary, and anyone who ever made you feel otherwise, including and especially myself, is a fool." After he left, Evelyn sat in the drawing room for a long time, turning the conversation over in her mind. She had expected. She did not know what she had expected. Certainly not vulnerability, not honesty. Not this glimpse of a man completely different from the cold Duke who had humiliated her 2 years ago. "Well," Beatrice appeared in the doorway, her curiosity barely contained. "How did it go?" "Confusingly," Evelyn replied, "he was not what I expected." "Do you believe him when he says he wishes to make amends?" Evelyn thought carefully before answering. "I believe he believes himself. Whether that belief translates to sustained action remains to be seen. Over the following weeks, Alexander proved remarkably consistent. He called upon Evelyn 3 times a week, always respectful of her time and boundaries. He escorted her to exhibitions at the Royal Academy, where they discussed art and science with the ease of old friends. He attended lectures at the Royal Society with her, never once suggesting the subjects were too complex for feminine understanding. Their conversations ranged widely. He asked about her teaching, genuinely interested in her methods and philosophy of education. She learned about the management of his vast estates, surprised by his progressive views on tenant rights and agricultural innovation. They debated literature, politics, natural philosophy, discovering areas of agreement and disagreement alike. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Evelyn felt her guard beginning to lower. It was not just Alexander's words that effected this change, but his actions. When Lord Whitmore, the gentleman who had fled her presence years ago, made a snide comment about over-educated women at a dinner party, Alexander had quietly but firmly destroyed the man's arguments with logic so elegant that Whitmore had retreated in humiliation. When Miss Caroline Winters attempted to monopolize Alexander's attention at the theatre, he had politely but unmistakably redirected his focus to Evelyn. Most tellingly, he made no attempt to rush her, to press for declarations or commitments. He simply showed up, consistently and sincerely, demonstrating through accumulated small actions that his regard was neither performance nor passing fancy. "You are falling in love with him," Beatrice observed one afternoon, as Evelyn prepared for yet another outing with the Duke. "I am not," Evelyn protested automatically. "Dearest sister, you smile when his notes arrive. You take extra care with your appearance on days you know you will see him. You quote his observations in conversation and defend his character when others speak ill of him." Beatrice's smile was gentle. "See, if that is not love, it is certainly its precursor." Evelyn sank onto her bed, the weight of truth settling over her. "I am terrified," she whispered. "What if I allow myself to care for him and he changes? What if this is all just temporary?" "What if it is not?" Beatrice countered. "What if you deny yourself happiness out of fear and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been?" Before Evelyn could respond, a commotion arose from the street below. She moved to the window to see Alexander's carriage stopped abruptly in front of the house, the Duke himself leaping out before it had fully halted. Something was wrong. Even from this distance, Evelyn could see the tension in his bearing, the urgency in his movements. She hurried downstairs, meeting him in the entrance hall as the butler opened the door. Evelyn, Alexander's use of her given name, his obvious distress, sent alarm through her. "Thank God you are here. I need your help." "What has happened?" "It is my ward, Sophie. My cousin's daughter. She has been staying at Ashbourne House since her parents died last year. She has fallen quite ill with a fever, and she is asking for you." "For me?" Evelyn could not hide her surprise. "But I have never met her." "I know, but I have told her about you, about your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. She has formed an attachment to the idea of you, and now she is asking for Miss Evelyn repeatedly." Alexander's composure cracked slightly. "The physician says the fever is not dangerous, but she is frightened and will not be comforted. I know it is an imposition. But would you come? Please." Evelyn did not hesitate. "Of course. Let me fetch my cloak." The journey to Ashbourne House took only minutes, but Alexander used the time to explain. "Sophie is 8 years old. Her parents were killed in a carriage accident 14 months ago. She came to live with me, but I confess I have no idea how to comfort a grieving child. I am too formal, too distant. She needs warmth I am not certain I can provide." "You love her," Evelyn observed, hearing the emotion beneath his words. "More than I knew I could love anyone," Alexander admitted. "She is the closest thing to family I have. The thought of her suffering, of being unable to help her." He trailed off, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. They found Sophie in a pretty chamber decorated in rose and cream, looking very small in her large bed. The little girl's face was flushed with fever, her dark hair damp against the pillow. "Sophie, darling," Alexander said gently, approaching the bed. "I have brought Miss Evelyn to see you." The child's eyes, so like Alexander's, fixed on Evelyn with desperate hope. "You came." "Of course I came," Evelyn said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years working with young students. "Your guardian told me you were unwell, and I could not possibly stay away." "Uncle Alex says you are very clever and kind," Sophie said, her voice raspy. "He says you teach girls like me." "I do indeed." Evelyn brushed damp hair from the child's forehead. "Phyllis and I confess I have been hoping to meet you. Your uncle speaks of you often and with great affection." "He does." Sophie glanced toward Alexander, who had positioned himself near the fireplace, giving them space but unable to leave entirely. "Oh, yes. He told me you are learning Latin and that you have a particular fondness for astronomy, just as he does." Over the next several hours, Evelyn stayed at Sophie's bedside, telling stories, holding the child's hand through periods of distress, and generally providing the maternal comfort the little girl so desperately needed. Alexander remained present, sometimes pacing, sometimes sitting in a chair by the window, his eyes never leaving his ward for long. "As she is fortunate to have you," Evelyn told him during a moment when Sophie had drifted into restless sleep. "Many men in your position would have sent her off to school or foisted her care onto distant relatives." "I could never do that," Alexander said quietly. "She has already lost so much. How could I abandon her as well?" Watching him with Sophie, seeing his gentleness with the frightened child, his patience during her feverish crying, Evelyn felt something shift decisively in her heart. This was not the cold Duke of Ashbourne. This was a man capable of deep love, profound care and tender devotion. This was a man she could love in return. Near midnight, Sophie's fever broke. The physician, summoned back for examination, pronounced her on the mend and requiring only rest and careful nursing. Evelyn had prepared to leave, but Sophie clutched her hand. "Please stay," the little girl whispered. "Just until I fall asleep properly." "Of course, darling." Evelyn remained at the bedside, humming softly, until Sophie's breathing evened into genuine sleep. Only then did she carefully extract her hand and rise. Alexander was waiting in the corridor outside, his face haggard with relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "I do not know what I would have done without you tonight." "You would have managed," Evelyn replied. "You love her, and love finds a way." "Does it?" Alexander asked, and suddenly they were no longer speaking only of Sophie. His eyes held Evelyn's, dark and intense. Does love always find a way, even when obstacles seem insurmountable? Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, she realized, the moment when she chose either fear or courage, either to retreat to safety or to step forward into uncertainty. "I believe it does," she said softly. "When that love is genuine and patient, when it is demonstrated through action rather than merely proclaimed through words." Alexander moved closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness. "Evelyn, I have been patient. I have tried to demonstrate through every action that my regard is sincere, that my feelings are real and lasting. But I must know, is there any hope, any possibility that you might come to care for me as I care for you?" "I already care for you," Evelyn confessed, the words both liberating and terrifying. "Against my better judgment, despite every logical reason not to, I have come to care for you deeply." "Then may I court you?" Alexander asked formally, truly and openly, with the intention of making you my duchess if you will have me. Evelyn searched his face one final time, looking for any hint of deception or uncertainty. She found only love, profound and unmistakable. "Yes," she whispered, "you may court me." Alexander closed the remaining distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, gentle and consuming. It was a kiss that spoke of loneliness ended, of two souls finding each other against all odds, of love emerging from the ashes of cruelty and pain. When they finally parted, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Evelyn Ashcroft. I love your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. I love the way you see me as I truly am and choose me anyway. I love every inch of your height, every year of your age, every aspect of who you are." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than pain. "I love you too," she admitted. "I never thought I would say those words to anyone, certainly not to you, but they are true nonetheless." "Will you marry me?" Alexander asked, his voice urgent. "I know it is soon, I know I should wait, but Evelyn, I have wasted too much time already in coldness and isolation. I do not want to waste another moment." Evelyn laughed through her tears. The Duke of Ashbourne, proposing in a corridor at midnight. How utterly unromantic and perfectly wonderful. "Is that a yes?" "It is a yes," Evelyn confirmed, and then she was in his arms again, and there were no more words needed. The announcement of the Duke of Ashbourne's engagement to Lady Evelyn Ashcroft sent shockwaves through London society. The betting books at White's, which had recorded wagers that the Duke would never marry, were closed with significant losses on all sides. Gossips who had mocked Evelyn's return to London now scrambled to claim they had always known she possessed hidden charms. Those who had been cruel found themselves suddenly excluded from fashionable gatherings, the Duke having made clear that anyone who spoke ill of his future Duchess was no friend of his. Lady Remington, who had insulted Evelyn at the musicale, found herself quietly but firmly ostracized from society. Her apology, delivered through an intermediary, was graciously accepted by Evelyn, but did nothing to restore her position. The message was clear. Cruelty toward the Duchess of Ashbourne would not be tolerated. The wedding took place 6 weeks later at St. George's Quay, Hanover Square. Sophie served as flower girl, beaming with pride and completely recovered from her illness. Beatrice wept happy tears throughout the ceremony. The Dowager Countess of Roxbury smiled with satisfaction, having predicted this outcome from the beginning. But the most remarkable moment came when Alexander spoke his vows. His voice, usually so controlled and measured, shook with emotion as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Evelyn for all his days. And when Evelyn spoke her own vows, her voice clear and strong, she added words not traditionally included in the ceremony. "I promise to see you always as you truly are, not as the world perceives you. I promise to stand beside you in warmth, never in coldness. I promise to build with you a life of genuine feeling, honest emotion, and enduring love." There was not a dry eye in the church. The wedding breakfast at Ashbourne House was a joyous affair, filled with laughter and celebration, but the most precious moments came later, When Alexander and Evelyn were finally alone in his study, the door closed against the world. "My Duchess," Alexander said wonderingly, pulling her into his arms. "I can scarcely believe you are mine." "Our Duchess," Evelyn corrected with a smile. "I belong to myself first, remember." "As it should be," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple, "though I hope you will choose to belong with me as well." "Always," Evelyn promised. "We have both been cold and lonely for too long. I look forward to a lifetime of warmth." Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his eyes serious. "I swear to you, Evelyn, I will spend every day of our marriage proving myself worthy of your trust. I will never again be that cold, cruel man who hurt you. That Duke of Ashbourne is gone." "No," Evelyn corrected gently. "He is not gone. He is simply thawed. And I love him all the more for having known winter, because now he truly appreciates the spring." As Alexander kissed his wife, the woman who had transformed his frozen heart into something warm and living, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He had driven her away with cruelty, only to discover that in her absence, London had become unbearably cold. He had pursued her return with desperation, only to find that she no longer needed London or him or anything beyond herself. And in that independence, that self-possessed strength, he had found the only person capable of warming his frozen heart. Sometimes, he thought as he held Evelyn close, the most precious things in life are those we push away before we understand their value. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate, we are given the chance to choose better, to be better, to love with the full warmth of hearts no longer frozen. Evelyn had given him that chance, and he would spend the rest of his life being grateful. Years later, when Sophie was preparing for her own debut, she would ask her aunt and uncle about their courtship. And they would tell her the truth, that love can emerge from cruelty, that people can change, and that the coldest hearts, when properly thawed, love with the greatest warmth of all. It was not a fairy tale. It was something better. A story of two flawed people who found each other, fought for each other, and chose each other despite every reason not to. And in the end, that was the most romantic story of all. The end. Dear reader, may you always remember that your worth is not determined by others' narrow judgments. Like Evelyn, you are extraordinary simply by being yourself, tall, short, young, old, conventional, or peculiar. The right person will see your true value, not as you apologize for existing, but as you stand confidently in your own truth. And the coldest hearts, when touched by genuine love, can become the warmest of all. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.